Right, we hope no danger to anybody when it went down.
Well, that's the thing is that when number 2 went down, I don't think.
The U.S. Geological Survey website provides us with a definition of a pyroclastic flow as a ground-hugging avalanche of hot gas and debris.
Huge buildings that have been here so long would actually just fall, and that's what happened. They just crumbled.
The rising gas chimney is clearly visible in this photo of the North Tower implosion with pyroclastic flows between buildings. The cauliflower shape of the debris clouds is a telltale sign of pyroclastic flows generated by massive explosions typical of volcanic eruptions and controlled demolitions.
This is like watching the collapse of an active volcano, and the dust from it is not unlike that from a volcano. We are on the phone with New York Fire Department Lieutenant David Restuccio. Lieutenant, where are you right now?
I'm at the corner of Northmore Street and Greenwich Street.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down, or it would be taken down, or it would be taken down, or it would be taken down.
Could you talk about how you were able to rule out the controlled demolition or any controlled demolition hypothesis, and also address whether you looked at some of the studies that Stephen Jones did about the evidence of thermate possibly being used to cut through the beams?
Yeah, as I said before, we conducted this investigation with an open mind. The way we proceeded to do that is, of course, there are many ways we could do it. We could have done it the way controlled demolition is actually done in practice, where charges are placed on multiple columns, which would imply a huge amount of charges to be placed. We instead decided, what is the worst case scenario, meaning what is the minimum amount of charge we could use to build this building down? And when we looked at that, we said, well, if column 79 is in fact what caused this building to come down under fire, let's assume we have a charge that can be placed directly on column 79, which of course most people would not know is the critical column, just because that was not, we found that out after the analysis that we did. So assume that we actually can do that. And as a result of that, we found that even the smallest charge would lead to an incredibly large sound half a mile away in an urban setting, which would be as loud as a gunshot blast, as loud as an engine of a jet plane, and 10 times louder than being directly in front of speakers at a rock concert.
The idea that thermate cut through the beams, it wasn't actually an explosion that caused the beams to cut, so that could probably be done a lot more quietly, right?
Yeah.
At Stephen Jones's work.
Well, the issue of thermate did not even reach in our judgment a level of importance sufficient to in fact do a detailed analysis. We could rule it out fairly easily for several reasons. One, in order for a thermate reaction to take place, there has to be materials, and of course building materials have all of the things that are required for thermite or thermate. And if you looked at the amount of thermite or thermate that would be needed to build this building down, you would have had to place about 100 pounds of thermite right in proximity to the column, and it had to have always adhered to the column, because what thermite does is actually it melts the steel. So somebody has to keep pushing it so that the thermite continues to be sticking to the steel, this vertical column, until it actually collapses.
In addition to giving off heat and white smoke, thermate produces lots of small spheres of iron. These iron spheres are a natural byproduct of thermate and not from any steel, just like those iron spheres found all through the dust. I'm an engineer who designs and builds things, and I'm certainly no explosive expert. My first problem was to find a container that could hold the thermate long enough to melt the steel while not melting itself. I didn't think that steel would work as a container, so I had to improvise using some normal roof tile that I cut in half. I then had to devise a way to hold it against the connection. I used strong magnets and a spring tooth from a hay rake to press 5 pounds of thermate on each side of the double angle connection. I lit the thermate, and it did absolutely nothing to the steel connection. Maybe thermate cannot melt steel, and maybe National Geographic was right. But the steel did not melt, meaning that perhaps a container could be made out of steel after all. Using an ordinary steel box tube, I had a slot milled along one edge. Welding the bottom and using clamps on the top to hold the powdered thermate in, I bolted it to a steel beam vertically. I called this device my thermitic box cutter. With only 1.5 pounds of thermate, or less than 1/100th of what the National Geographic experts used for their experiment. Not only was I able to melt steel, but it also sliced a vertical cut. So I made a slightly larger thermitic box cutter and used 2 3/8 bolts drilled and tapped on one side of the connection. It only took a slight twist to break it completely off. I noticed as the thermate burned, it tended to lose its cutting power, perhaps because it could expand into the area where the box cutter previously burned. So I built a piston-driven box cutter using a compressed car hatch piston. I added sheets of tungsten to minimize the burnout and allow the piston to slide better. I then bolted my contraption to the flange of the column and ignited the white-hot magnesium. It appears that not only can thermate melt steel, but it can also cut vertical columns. So why bother to use incendiaries like thermate and not high explosives? I think it's all about keeping things quiet before the main event. Using thermate may take longer to weaken such large columns in the towers, which may be why we see the molten steel several minutes before its final destruction. Here is less than 1 3/4 pounds of thermate, or 1/100th of what National Geographic used, quietly burning. And here is less than 4 pounds of thermate focused on the web of a wide flange. Which can also be set up on a vertical column. The web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance. Can thermate cut bolts? I guess it can. But what if just the head of the bolt is exposed rather than the nut and the threads? Can thermate be configured to cut just the bolt head? I guess it can. And without any evidence on the other side. I don't think that something like my piston-driven box cutter was bolted to the office walls, or trash bags full of thermite used. It's more likely that any pre-weakening thermitic material were hidden inside the perimeter box columns. I had a replica of a segment of the WTC box columns made up. And like the Trade Center iron workers, I bolted the segments together. It made 2 sets of my 2 bolt blasters, placing them in the access hole. Let's listen to another eyewitness.
Like, it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Is it even possible that thermate could do this? I guess it is. I made a 4-sided box cutter split in 2 pieces so they could be inserted inside the column. I held it up on the burnt-out bolt blasters and thought I could hold it down with magnets. Let's see what happens. I think my box cutter blew about 30 feet up, consuming valuable energy and trimming my tree in the process. Nevertheless, the inside of the column was cut about 3/4 of the way through. Were thermitic devices or maybe explosive nanothermite sprayed inside those box columns? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure why this handhold is so large, or why the side of this box column looks like it's blown outward, or why 3 columns have a more intense glow, followed by 6 columns that don't, followed by another 3 that do. But I have an idea. But I do know that it's impossible for jet fuel or an office fire to melt steel or iron, which means the official story is wrong. Yet despite all the overwhelming evidence of explosions in molten steel, some people will still believe that this is aluminum and believe Building 7 fell naturally from an office fire. But those people will believe anything. Meanwhile, the government lies while the media hides the truth about 9/11.
Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams?
I guess it can. Isn't it time we use physical science rather than political science to investigate 9/11? Let's watch.
If thermite melts through this steel column, the theory of a thermite-controlled demolition may have some validity. While the truthers insist that more explosive super thermite could have been used in the tower demolitions, testing conventional thermite can illuminate this physical process and answer a simple question. Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams? Despite 175 pounds of thermite packed around the steel column, it remained undamaged.